Welcome back. This week's module is pretty straightforward. We're going to be looking at different types of groups and different types of organizations, and focusing a lot on clarifying and categorizing the various groups in our social interactions. So, a group is described as a collection of two or more people with similar norms, values, and expectations who interact with one another on a regular basis. Groups play a very vital part in our society's social structure, and social interaction often takes place within groups and is influenced by their norms and sanctions. Expectations that are associated with many social roles are more clearly defined in the context of a group. And groups can really serve this function of solidarity and influence recovery from traumatic events. A group can include even just two people or a dyad, or three people or a triad. And these are some of the most basic forms of groups. If I were to ask you which is the least stable, I always get various answers. Some say it's the dyad because it's so small, and some say it's the triad because it's uneven and there is a likelihood of people taking sides and risking the stability of the group. Truly, it is the dyad, and it's simply because if one person leaves, you no longer have a group, right? So that's it. So one of the things we have to clarify when it comes to groups is what is and what isn't a group. And the easiest way to do this is to tackle that second question. An aggregate is not a group. An aggregate is simply a collection of people who are in the same place at the same time, but they don't have a shared identity or interaction. If you were to go to a Beyonce or a Taylor Swift concert, you'd be in an aggregate. You're just in the same place at the same time, and maybe you might step on someone's foot or push someone by accident, but there's no real shared identity or shared interaction there. A category also isn't a group. A category is simply a collection of people who share similar characteristics but aren't connected in any other way. So you could say a collection of people who all wear glasses is a category of people, but not a group. Now, if they went to a Glasses Wearers Anonymous meeting on a regular basis, then those glasses wearers would shift from being just a category into being an actual group. Another thing that I want to point out now, but that we'll build on in the future, is conformity. And conformity really describes the extent to which an individual is compliant with group norms and expectations. And conformity often occurs um, along with membership or identity with a group. And so if we feel like we're a part of a group, we'll be more likely to conform to the norms and behaviors of that group and its expectations as well. There are many variations of groups. There are primary groups and secondary groups, where primary groups are small groups, often characterized by intimate, often face-to-face association, although not always, and cooperation. Some examples of primary groups are, of course, the family, as well as fraternities and sororities, and some other collectives that meet on a very regular and intimate basis. Primary groups are typically really important to our development because they serve a pivotal role in our socialization and in the production of our social roles and social statuses. And often they exist to serve an expressive function where the focus is on well being and emotional health, um, which in contrast doesn't really describe secondary groups. Secondary groups are formal, typically, they are impersonal, meaning that there's little social intimacy or mutual understanding. Really, there's not a focus here on that emotional health or well being or belonging. Instead, the focus is going to be on instrumental functions like achieving some goals or tackling some objectives and tasks. Some examples of secondary groups would be like the workplace and larger social clubs where there's less personal and intimate interaction. There's also in groups and out groups. And really, the name for these tells you what it is. An in group is a group or a category to which people feel like they belong. They usually come with feelings of being distinct or superior, like us against them. Where those who are in the in group are usually going to feel like they're more superior or more distinctive or unique. And where those who are in the out group will typically feel like they don't belong to that group or they don't identify with that group. And of course, the in group people will look at the out group people as if though they are not as cool, basically. Um, we then have reference groups as well, which can be in groups or out groups. But typically, this is where you're viewing a particular group as a standard for evaluating yourself and your own behavior. And reference groups are important because you are comparing yourself to those groups for a purpose. They serve a normative function by setting and enforcing standards of conduct and belief, and they perform a comparison function by serving as a standard against which people can measure themselves and others. So previously we talked about anticipatory socialization, and reference groups can be a part of that anticipatory socialization where you might compare yourself to members of those groups in order to um, prepare yourself for some role that you want to hold or to serve in the future. So if you want to be a doctor, you might actually pay attention to the behaviors and the roles um, and the norms of doctors and model yourselves after those. So groups are typically led by people, and the functions of that leadership can be either instrumental or expressive as well. So the function really depends on what the goal is of the leader. If the goal is to be very task oriented and focus on goals and objectives, then that leader is most likely to have an instrumental function. If the goal is to show concern for promoting strength and health and well being, then the leader is more likely to have the expressive types of function. It's probably not a surprise that these leadership functions are also tied to specific genders in our gender binary, where instrumental leadership is usually most likely to be associated with men, and expressive leadership is usually most likely to be associated with women. Regardless, this kind of leadership, either instrumental or expressive, can also take on one of three leadership styles. One is democratic leadership, and here all are expected to participate in decision making. And so there's usually a desire for a group's consensus before moving on or executing a plan. Democratic leadership styles can be slow, however, as you wait for everyone to agree on something. And democratic leadership can often uh, promote members ganging up into little groups where they create factions that can halt progress altogether. And so, while democratic may seem like the most fair or just type of leadership, it's not a great form of leadership when you need immediate and urgent action. Laissez faire leadership is based on this French phrase for leave it alone. And that's where a leader is completely like hands off. They allow the group members to self govern. And this one particularly works well if the members are highly motivated and if they have very clear and concise goals that are set. And then on the other end of this extreme, you have authoritarian leadership. And this is where leadership issues orders and assigns tasks without taking into consideration much of the input or feedback from members. When it comes to authoritarian leadership, there are some risks here as well. In particular, these sorts of leaders may risk alienation. And so really, if you were looking at these forms of leadership and, on a range. On the two ends, you might have laissez faire, where they're totally hands off, and authoritarian, where they're totally hands on. And then in the middle, you might see democratic leadership. but all have their pros, all have their cons. So here's your definition of an organization, which is any social network that's defined by a common purpose and has a boundary between its membership and the rest of the social world. And so SRJC would be considered an organization. All the schools that you grew up in would also be considered organizations. And then any levels, throughout the local governance and county level, to the region, to the state, to the entire country would also be different levels of organizations. When we talk about organizations, we look into some of the characteristics of those organizations, like whether they are formal or informal. Uh, in particular, we focus on formal organizations, those that are designed for a specific purpose and structure, and that work towards maximum efficiency. So you could see this in some corporations like McDonald's, or in some institutions or organizations like the Postal Service or UPS. Apparently, all I can think about is package delivery at the moment. When we talk about these organizations, we often look at their types, right? Are they normative or voluntary organizations, meaning that your participation is not required, that you voluntarily are involved in the group based on a shared interest with others? Are they utilitarian organizations? Like, do they meet for a specific material award or reward, like going to school or to work? Or are they coercive organizations where you're forced to join or where there's mandatory and required participation? And this can include groups like total institutions, which we talked about previously. We look at many formal organizations um, as bureaucracies or as being bureaucratic. And these are characteristics that are related to components of formal organizations that use rules and hierarchy to achieve efficiency. And so we'll look into that more next. So let's look at some of the characteristics of a bureaucracy. Um, Here we have 5 basic characteristics. The first being division of labor. Usually a bureaucracy is very specialized where each position has its particular and specific role. And we often look at that specialization as being um, kind of risky when it comes to alienation because you're so focused on your specific area that you may not feel like you are integrated into the entire organization, or you may feel a bit isolated. We also think that alienation and specialization can lead to something called trained incapacity, that you become so specialized that you might develop blind spots or fail to notice some obvious big picture things. The next characteristic is hierarchy of authority. Each person in a bureaucracy is under the supervision of a higher authority, right? So everyone has a boss, and often everyone is someone else's boss. Another characteristic of a bureaucracy is that it has written rules and regulations that are explicit. And these rules and regulations are formalized and codified, and they come with consequences if violated. Another characteristic that's usually one that people don't love is that these bureaucracies are impersonal. There's no personal consideration for individuals and their unique situations because of those rules and regulations. And so, for example, if you're looking at some sort of bureaucracy that uses an income scale, maybe you fall like $1 below that scale, right? And you have a very specific situation that requires you to have some resource that depends on that scale. Most bureaucracies do not do a case by case consideration, and it's just about whether or not you reach that nominal or that arbitrary requirement. And then finally, the membership or the employment within a bureaucracy is very much based on merit or on technical qualifications, right? Um, and often it could lead to a dysfunction of bureaucracy known as the Peter Principle, where some people receive promotion after promotion just as a result of seniority or just being in that place for a certain amount of time or of having some sort of degree or certification until eventually they rise to a position that is too difficult for them. And so they've kind of worked beyond their skill set.